Hey Platinum family, Dr. Infantino here again, and today we're going to talk about carbs, which is close but not quite a four-letter word. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And yeah, there are actually great sources of carbohydrates and you do need them, and there are terrible sources. And we're going to demystify the whole thing. What should you have, what shouldn't you have, at least not on a regular basis. We're going to talk about things like fiber, starch, sugars. We're going to break it all down. Whole grains versus processed grains. We'll talk about things called glycemic index, which is basically a measure of how quick a carbohydrate becomes sugar in the body. And that's going to be super important. So let's dive into it. Basically, there are three types of carbs. There's sugars, starches, and fibers. Sugar is found in things like fructose, which is fruit, lactose in milk, sucrose. In general, anything that ends in an OSE, especially later when you're reading labels a lot, OSE tends to be a sugar. So just be really careful because sugar goes by about 25 other names, if not more. So food manufacturers try to hide sugar in things. The problem with simple sugars is they spike blood sugar. Anytime blood sugar spikes quickly, you get an insulin response. Insulin, again, is a powerful fat storage hormone. The other problem with sugar is it feeds everything bad in the gut, yeast, etc. So most of what we're doing throughout this process is lower sugar. That doesn't mean low carb, it just means low simple sugars. The next category of carbohydrates are starches. Now starches fall into two main groups, the good ones and the bad ones. The good starches are things like brown rice, wild rice, lentils, quinoa. These starches you can enjoy during the program because they have fiber, they don't spike blood sugar very quickly, and generally they're good for you. Now, the bad starches, or the bad carbs, the ones that give carbs really a bad rap, is simply because man has processed them into things like bread, pasta, tortillas. Those are the guys that spike blood sugar. They feed yeast, they feed all the bad stuff in the gut, they actually cause cravings. So during your program, you're going to avoid those bad carbs. This does not mean you never can eat them again, but certainly for now, we're going to leave those out. The next category of carbohydrates are fiber, which are broken down into two groups, soluble and insoluble. Soluble and insoluble fibers are not digested, but they do feed the good bacteria, they detoxify the gut, they create a good bulk, healthy stool, and you'll be taking a fiber supplement to make sure you get enough. But in general, you do want to get about 25 to 35 grams of fiber per day. I'm not asking you to calculate this stuff, so don't worry about it. As you eat the foods according to the program, your coach will mention if you need more fiber or not. But in general, our good list of carbs will give you enough of the fiber, mostly from vegetable sources. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is something called glycemic index. The glycemic index is a number value assigned to a food, which basically tells us how fast it becomes blood sugar. So to give you an example, honey or table sugar would have a glycemic index that's very high, probably around 100, whereas chicken might have a glycemic index of maybe 0 or probably around 5. So the bottom line is the lower the number in general, the better when it comes to not creating an insulin response, which again is important because the more insulin you produce, the more our body wants to store fat. So I created a list of some common foods in their glycemic index, and I'd like to talk through it a little bit so you understand. So for instance, white bread has a glycemic index of about 77. Interestingly enough, whole wheat bread, about 87. Which makes them both really high. Same thing with like cornflakes, which comes in about 95. Pretty much sugar, right? Potatoes, about 82. Popcorn, 70. Pancakes, about 100. Now let's take a look at this list. These are foods that are carbohydrates but have a lower glycemic index. For instance, brown rice comes in at about 50, whereas white rice can come in at about 85. Pretty big difference. Non-starchy vegetables, they're like 0 to 20 on the glycemic scale. Some examples of those like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, things like that. Snickers bar, just to put it in perspective, comes in at about 60. So what would you rather eat, popcorn or a Snickers bar? Glycemic index is pretty similar. Just something to think about, right? Again, chicken, fish, turkey, really pretty much 0 to 10 on the glycemic index scale. So while I don't want you to worry too much about glycemic index, I would recommend just start looking foods up. Just Google glycemic index of fill in the blank, anything that you're interested in knowing. Because once you know it and you understand it, you'll be like, oh, okay, maybe I can make a better food choice here. Maybe my brown rice, for instance, might be a glycemic index of 50, whereas a brown rice cake might be 90. Gosh, maybe I just better eat the whole brown rice versus the processed version of it. Does that make sense? So think of it in terms of how much low glycemic food can I get in, particularly in the form of carbohydrates, because the other foods that we'll talk about, really like protein and fats, they don't hardly score on the scale at all, which is why in general, we tend to lean towards getting more calories from those sources. Another thing to consider when it comes to food in general is water content. Now, I know this might sound a little strange, but I want you to think about something. How much water would you say is in your average cracker or slice of bread or piece of pasta? Little to none, right? How much water is in a cucumber? A lot of water. Now, what does that mean? That means you could eat a whole lot more cucumbers, broccoli, cabbage, foods with more water than you can with foods with less water because they're more dense. So I would suggest when you're looking at something, think, well, what's the water content? Can I eat more water or high water content foods? In general, you'd just be a whole lot safer. Now, on the other side of the equation, there are starchy vegetables, right? Starchy vegetables are things like pumpkin and acorn squash. We call those winter squashes. You can have them during the program, but I would suggest limiting them. Sweet potatoes fall into this category also. Why should you limit them? Well, think of it this way. They have a higher glycemic index. They typically ripen when? In the fall. So if you think historically, what would be a food that ripens in the fall? What's the purpose of it? Well, to help you store body fat for winter. So again, I'm not saying some of the foods that have high glycemic index or these starchy vegetables are bad for you. But if your goal is to lose weight, keep insulin down, you do want to keep them lower at least for a period of time. And then eventually we reintroduce more of them depending on where you're at in the program. So just ask your coach.